The advertisement had been simple, practical. Cold as the Montana wind itself. Seeking wife. Must be strong, capable, and willing to work. No romantics, no illusions. Winter is coming. Caleb Mercer had written it himself, sitting at the scarred wooden table in his kitchen, the oil lamp flickering against the gathering dark. He'd stared at the words for a long time before folding the paper and sending it off to the matrimonial agency in Denver. 3 weeks later, he stood on the platform of the train station in Bitterroot, Montana, waiting for a woman he'd never seen. October wind cut across the platform, carrying the smell of coming snow. Caleb pulled his coat tighter, his breath misting in the cold. Around him, the small crowd shifted and murmured, ranch hands picking up supplies, a few families reuniting, the usual traffic of a frontier town preparing for the hard months ahead. He wasn't nervous. Nerves required hope, and Caleb had learned to live without that particular burden. The train came around the bend with a shriek of metal and steam, its black bulk cutting through the gray afternoon. Caleb watched it slow, watched the passengers begin to descend. Families, businessmen, a few rough-looking prospectors heading for the mining camps in the hills. Then he saw her. She stepped down from the passenger car with the careful grace of someone used to being watched. Tall, dark-haired, wearing a traveling dress that had probably been expensive once, but now showed the dust of long miles. She carried a single carpet bag and moved with the kind of composure that made everyone else on the platform look rushed and graceless by comparison. Caleb's stomach dropped. This couldn't be her. The woman he'd arranged for was supposed to be practical. Plain, probably. Someone grateful for the security of marriage, willing to work hard in exchange for a roof and a name. Someone who understood what frontier life actually meant. This woman looked like she'd stepped out of a painting in some rich man's parlor. She scanned the platform, her dark eyes cool and assessing. When they landed on him, something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or disappointment, before her expression smoothed into careful neutrality. She walked toward him, not hurrying, not hesitating, just walking, like she'd already made up her mind about something and there was no point in pretending otherwise. "Mr. Mercer?" Her voice was lower than he'd expected. Steady. That's right. He didn't move to take her bag. "You're Miss Hart?" "Lillian Hart." She set the carpet bag down between them like a barrier, though I assume the miss won't apply much longer. Direct. He could appreciate that, at least. "There's been a mistake," Caleb said. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Has there?" "The agency was supposed to send someone—" He stopped himself, but not quickly enough. "Someone what?" Lillian's voice stayed level, but something sharp moved behind her eyes. "Someone less trouble? Someone more desperate? Someone who understood what they were getting into." "I understand perfectly." She looked past him, toward the rough buildings of Bitterroot, the mountains rising dark beyond them. "You need a wife who can work, who won't complain about the isolation or the cold or the fact that you're clearly not interested in anything beyond basic survival. I need—" She paused, and for just a second the careful composure cracked. "I need to disappear. This seemed like a good place for it." The wind picked up, colder now. A few scattered snowflakes drifted across the platform. "What are you running from?" Caleb asked. "Does it matter?" "Could be. If someone's going to follow you here, no one's following me." She met his eyes. "I made sure of that." They stood there, two strangers sizing each other up in the gathering cold. Around them, the platform was emptying. The train whistle blew, impatient. Caleb knew he should send her back. Whatever she was running from, whatever brought a woman like her to answer an ad like his, it would only complicate things. He needed simple. He needed functional. He needed someone who wouldn't expect anything from him except basic decency and hard work. But winter was 2 weeks away, maybe less, and he'd already sold off half his breeding stock to pay the agency fee. And standing here in front of him was a woman who'd traveled 1,000 miles to escape something she wouldn't name, which meant she probably wouldn't leave easily even if he tried to send her away. "The ranch is 2 hours north," he said finally. "We'll stay in town tonight. There's a preacher at the church. We can get it done in the morning." Something that might have been relief crossed her face. "All right." "I'm not—" He stopped, trying to find words that wouldn't sound cruel. This isn't a love match. I want that clear from the start. Mr. Mercer, Lillian picked up her carpet bag. I wouldn't be here if I was looking for love. I'm looking for a life that doesn't involve looking over my shoulder every time I hear footsteps. You're offering that. In exchange, I'll work harder than you probably expect me to. That's the deal. Fine. Fine. They walked toward town in silence, the first snow of the season beginning to fall in earnest. The boarding house was clean but spare, run by a widow named Mrs. Hutchins, who asked too many questions and smiled too much. Caleb paid for 2 rooms and left Lillian to settle in while he went to arrange things with the preacher. Reverend Walsh was a thin, earnest man who'd come west with dreams of saving souls and found mostly hard ground and harder people. He listened to Caleb's request with poorly concealed disapproval. You're certain about this? You've only just met the woman. That's the arrangement. Marriage is a sacred covenant, Mr. Mercer. It requires 2 people and someone to say the words. Caleb put $20 on the desk between them. Can you do it or not? Walsh looked at the money, then at Caleb's face. Whatever he saw there made him sigh and nod. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Caleb spent the night in his rented room, staring at the ceiling and wondering what the hell he was doing. He'd been alone for 3 years. After Sarah died, after the fever took her and their son both in the space of a week, he'd promised himself he wouldn't do this again. Wouldn't let anyone close enough to hurt him. Wouldn't risk feeling that particular kind of helpless rage that came from watching someone you loved slip away while you stood there unable to do a damn thing about it. This was different, though. This was practical. A business arrangement. Lillian Hart needed a place to hide, and he needed someone to help him get through the winter without losing everything he'd built. No emotions, no expectations, just 2 people doing what they needed to do to survive. He almost believed it. The ceremony took 10 minutes. They stood in the small church while Reverend Walsh read through the abbreviated service, his voice echoing in the empty space. Mrs. Hutchins and her husband served as witnesses, both of them beaming like they were watching something romantic instead of 2 strangers making a practical exchange. Lillian wore the same traveling dress from yesterday, brushed clean. She'd pinned her dark hair up, revealing a long neck and the kind of posture that spoke of a very different upbringing than anything Caleb had known. When Walsh asked her to repeat the vows, her voice never wavered. Caleb heard himself make the same promises. To honor. To cherish. Words that meant something in a real marriage, but here were just part of the transaction. You may kiss the bride, Walsh said. Caleb hesitated. They hadn't discussed this part. Lillian looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then she leaned in and pressed her lips briefly to his, cool, impersonal, over before it really began. Congratulations, Walsh said, sounding like he meant the opposite. They signed the register. Mrs. Hutchins cried a little. Her husband shook Caleb's hand with too much enthusiasm. Then it was done. Caleb Mercer had a wife. The wagon ride north was quiet. Lillian sat beside him on the bench, her carpet bag at her feet, watching the landscape change from the rough civilization of Bitterroot to the wild country beyond. The road, such as it was, cut through stands of pine and open meadow, following the curve of the valley toward the high country where Caleb's ranch sat tucked against the mountains. The snow had stopped, but the sky stayed gray and heavy. More was coming. Caleb could feel it in the air, in the way the wind moved through the trees. How much land? Lillian asked eventually. 600 acres, most of it grazing land. He kept his eyes on the road. Got about 40 head of cattle right now, some horses. Used to have more, but I had to sell off stock to make it through last winter. What happened? Market crashed. Prices went to hell. Lost a lot of animals to the cold. He paused. Lost my hired man, too. He headed to California in the spring, said he was done with Montana winters. So it's just you. Was. Now it's us. She was quiet for a moment. What do you need me to do? Everything. He glanced at her. Cooking, cleaning, helping with the animals when I need it. The ranch isn't big, but it's more than one person can handle alone, especially once the snow gets deep. I can do that. You ever worked with livestock before? No? At least she was honest. You'll learn, or you won't, and we'll both freeze to death. Either way, it'll sort itself out. She almost smiled. Almost. You're not much for optimism, are you? Optimism doesn't feed the cattle or keep the roof from caving in. Fair enough. They rode in silence for another hour. The road climbed steadily, the air getting thinner and colder. Caleb pointed out landmarks as they passed. The creek that marked the southern boundary of his property, the line of fence that needed repairing before winter really hit, the stand of aspen where he'd shot an elk last fall that kept him fed for 2 months. Lillian took it all in without comment. She didn't ask stupid questions or exclaim over the scenery like some city woman on a touring holiday. She just watched and listened, learning the shape of her new world. Finally, they came around a bend, and there it was, the ranch. It wasn't much. A log cabin with a stone chimney, solidly built but showing its age. A barn that leaned slightly to one side but still stood. A few outbuildings in various states of disrepair. Fences that needed work. Corrals empty except for a few horses that lifted their heads to watch the wagon approach. Lillian looked at it all, her face carefully blank. "It's not what you're used to," Caleb said. "Not an apology, just a fact." "No." She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. "But it'll do." The cabin was one large room with a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder, a cast-iron stove for cooking, a fireplace for heat, a rough-hewn table and chairs, a bed in the corner that Caleb had built himself 3 years ago, back when he still thought. He stopped that thought before it could finish. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep in the loft." Lillian set her carpet bag down near the table. "That's not necessary." "Yeah, it is." She turned to look at him. "We're married, Mr. Mercer. People can expect whatever they want. This is the arrangement." For a long moment, they stood there in the dim cabin, the space between them charged with something neither of them wanted to name. "All right," Lillian said finally, "if that's how you want it." "It is." She nodded and moved to examine the stove, running her hand along its surface. "When was the last time this was cleaned?" "A while." "I'll take care of it tomorrow." She opened the cupboard, found it mostly empty except for some basic staples. "And we'll need supplies. There's a root cellar out back. I put up what I could in the fall, but it's not much. We'll have to make it stretch." "I'm good at making things stretch." She said it quietly, like she was talking to herself more than to him. Caleb wanted to ask what she meant, wanted to know what kind of life required learning how to survive on almost nothing. But asking would mean inviting her to ask questions in return, and he wasn't ready for that. "I need to check on the animals," he said instead. "You should rest. It's been a long day." "I'll come with you." "You don't need to." "I need to learn, don't I?" She was already reaching for her coat. "Better to start now." He couldn't argue with that. The barn smelled like hay and horse and the particular warmth of large animals in an enclosed space. Caleb lit a lantern and hung it from a hook near the door, casting long shadows across the stalls. There were 4 horses, 3 geldings used for working the ranch, and 1 mare, heavily pregnant, who watched them approach with large, nervous eyes. "That's Juniper," Caleb said. "She's due any day now, maybe tonight, the way she's acting." Lillian moved closer to the stall, slow and careful. "First time?" "Third, but she had trouble with the last one, lost the foal and nearly died herself." He checked the water trough, found it needed filling. "I'm hoping this time goes better." "What do you do if there's trouble?" "Whatever I can. Sometimes it's enough. Sometimes it's not." Lillian reached out, let the mare sniff her hand. Juniper nickered softly, then went back to her hay. "She likes you," Caleb said, surprised. "Animals usually do. It's people I have trouble with." Before he could respond to that, Juniper's head came up sharply. She shifted in the stall, restless, her breathing changing. "Something's wrong," Lillian said. Caleb was already moving, opening the stall gate. The mare's sides were heaving, sweat darkening her coat. "She's starting. Damn it, I was hoping we'd have another day or 2. "What do you need?" "Clean towels? There's some in the cabin, in the chest by the bed. And bring the medical kit. It's on the shelf by the door." Lillian ran. Caleb stayed with Juniper, talking to her in a low voice, trying to keep her calm. The mare went down on her side, her legs kicking out. He could see the foal starting to emerge, but something was off. The position wasn't right. If it came out wrong, both of them would die. Lillian came back at a run, her arms full of supplies. She didn't waste time with questions, just knelt beside him and waited for instructions. "I need to turn the foal," Caleb said. "It's coming out backwards. Hold her head. Keep her as still as you can." Lillian moved to the mare's head, placing her hands on either side of Juniper's neck. "It's all right," she murmured. "We've got you. You're going to be fine." Caleb stripped off his coat and rolled up his sleeves. This was the part he hated. The knowledge that one wrong move could kill both animals. That all his strength and experience might not be enough. That sometimes things just went wrong no matter what you did. Sarah had died on a spring morning with the sun coming through the bedroom window. His son had followed her that same night. 3 years, and Caleb could still remember the exact quality of the light, the specific sound of his own breathing in the terrible quiet after it was over. He pushed the memory away and focused on the work in front of him. The foal was large, too large really, and positioned all wrong. Caleb worked carefully, his hands slick with blood and fluid, trying to find purchase, trying to guide the small body into the right position without causing damage. Juniper thrashed, fighting against the pain and the intrusion. "Keep her steady," Caleb said through gritted teeth. "I've got her." Lillian's voice was calm, certain, like she'd done this 100 times before. Caleb felt the foal shift. Just a little, but it might be enough. He pulled, gentle but firm, trying to ease the small body out without tearing anything important. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then the foal came free in a rush of fluid and blood, sliding onto the straw in a wet heap. It wasn't moving. "No." Caleb grabbed one of the towels and started rubbing the foal down, clearing its airways, trying to stimulate breathing. Come on, damn it!" Lillian was there beside him, her hands moving over the small body, checking for a heartbeat. "It's still alive. Give it a second." "It's not breathing. Give it a second." She pressed her hands against the foal's ribs, pumping gently. Once, twice, 3 times. The foal gasped, then it coughed, and suddenly it was breathing, its sides heaving with the effort, its legs twitching as life flooded back into its small body. Caleb sat back on his heels, his hands shaking. Jesus. "It's all right." Lillian kept her hands on the foal, steadying it. "You did it." "We did it." He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since she'd stepped off that train. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins. Her dress was ruined, covered in blood, and worse. But her hands were steady and her eyes were clear, and she looked like someone who'd just fought death and won. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. "My father raised horses before—" She stopped. "A long time ago. I used to help him." There was a story there, something painful enough that she couldn't finish the sentence. But before Caleb could decide whether to push, Juniper lifted her head and nickered, looking for her foal. Lillian smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and helped guide the foal toward its mother. "Here you go, Mama. Look what you made." They stayed in the barn for another hour, making sure both animals were stable. The foal, a filly, dark like her mother, managed to stand on shaky legs and find her way to nursing. Juniper, exhausted but alive, let them check her over for any damage. "She'll be all right," Caleb said finally. "They both will." Lillian nodded, still watching the mare and foal with something soft in her expression. "What will you name her?" "The filly? I don't know. Haven't thought about it." "You should name her Hope." "That's a hell of a name for a horse." "Maybe, but she earned it tonight." Lillian stood, brushing straw from her ruined, wet dress. "We all did." They walked back to the cabin through the dark, the first stars beginning to show through breaks in the clouds. The temperature was dropping fast. By morning, there would be ice on the water troughs and frost thick on the ground. Inside, Caleb lit the fire while Lillian heated water on the stove. They took turns washing the blood off their hands and arms, not speaking, the silence between them different now than it had been on the wagon ride north. "Thank you," Caleb said finally, "for what you did in the barn. You would have managed without me." "Maybe, maybe not. He dried his hands on a towel, watching her move around the small kitchen like she'd been there for years instead of hours. You were right about knowing how to work. I underestimated you. People usually do. She hung the wet towel to dry. I'm used to it. I won't make that mistake again. She looked at him, something unreadable in her dark eyes. Good. They ate a simple meal, bread and cheese and some dried meat from the stores. Lillian made coffee that was actually drinkable, which was more than Caleb had managed in 3 years of trying. They sat at the table, two strangers who were now married, bound together by law and necessity and the memory of a foal taking its first breath. I'll teach you the rest tomorrow, Caleb said. How to manage the other animals, how to work the land, everything you need to know to make it through the winter. All right? It won't be easy. I didn't come here for easy, Mr. Mercer. Caleb, he said, if we're going to be married, you should probably use my name. Caleb. She tested it like she was trying on new clothes. And you can call me Lillian, or Lily, if you prefer. My father used to call me that. Lillian suits you better. She almost smiled again. Does it? Yeah, Lily sounds too soft. You're not soft. No, she agreed. I'm not. She climbed up to the loft that night while he took the bed in the corner. Caleb lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind pick up outside, thinking about the woman sleeping above him. She'd saved Juniper and the foal, had worked beside him without hesitation or complaint, had proven in one night that she was exactly the kind of partner he needed, capable, unafraid, willing to do what was necessary. But there was something else too, something he didn't want to acknowledge. When she'd smiled at that foal, when she'd said they all earned hope tonight, for just a second he'd felt something crack open inside his chest, something he'd thought was dead and sealed away. It scared the hell out of him. Outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall, and Caleb Mercer closed his eyes and tried not to think about what he'd gotten himself into. The snow came hard that first week, turning the world white and silent. Caleb woke before dawn each morning to find ice thick on the windows and the temperature so low that water left in a cup overnight would be frozen solid by morning. He'd pull on his boots and coat in the dark, careful not to wake Lillian in the loft above, and head out to break ice in the water troughs and throw hay to the cattle huddled in the lee of the barn. By the time he came back in, she'd have the fire going and coffee on the stove. She never mentioned how cold it got at night up in that loft, never complained that the ladder was steep or that the space was cramped. She just came down each morning with her hair pinned back and her sleeves already rolled up, ready to work. They fell into a rhythm without discussing it. Caleb would handle the heavy outdoor work, cutting wood, repairing fences before they disappeared under the snow, checking on the cattle scattered across the grazing land. Lillian took over the cabin, transforming it from the bachelor disaster it had been into something that almost felt like a home. She could stretch their meager supplies in ways that surprised him, turning dried beans and salt pork into meals that actually tasted like something. She organized the root cellar, rotated their stores, mended his clothes before he even realized they needed it. But it was the work with the animals that really got his attention. On the third morning, he found her in the barn before sunrise, sitting on an overturned bucket beside Juniper's stall. The mare had her head out, and Lillian was talking to her in a low voice, one hand stroking the horse's nose. Couldn't sleep? Caleb asked. Lillian didn't startle. I wanted to check on them. The foal was coughing last night. Hope's fine. Young horses cough. It's normal. I know. I just wanted to be sure. She stood, brushing hay from her skirt. Your gelding in the far stall, the roan one. He's favoring his left foreleg. Caleb frowned. Which one? Copper? If that's the reddish one, yes. He moved to the stall, watching the horse shift his weight. Sure enough, Copper was keeping most of his weight off the left front. Damn, I didn't notice yesterday. It's probably just a stone bruise, but you should check it before it gets worse. She was right. He picked out the hoof and found the beginning of an abscess forming. Nothing serious yet, but it would have been if he'd let it go another few days. How did you see that? He asked. I pay attention. She moved past him to grab the pitchfork and started mucking out the stalls. My father always said horses will tell you what's wrong if you bother to listen. Your father sounds like he knew his business. her hand stilled on the pitchfork handle. He did, before the debt took everything. She said it flat, like she was stating a fact about the weather. But Caleb heard what was underneath, the kind of loss that didn't heal, just scarred over. "That why you answered the ad?" he asked. "The debt?" "Part of it." She went back to work, her movements efficient. "The men my father owed didn't care that he was dead. They came after what was left. I had a choice. Marry one of them to settle the debt or disappear. I chose to disappear. They would have forced you. They would have called it marriage. I would have called it something else." She tossed a forkful of soiled hay into the wheelbarrow. "Either way, I wasn't staying to find out." Caleb wanted to ask more, but something in the set of her shoulders told him she was done talking about it. Instead, he grabbed another pitchfork and worked alongside her, the two of them moving through the morning chores in a silence that felt less awkward than it had a few days ago. When they finished, Lillian went to check on Hope again. The filly was doing well, growing stronger each day, her legs steadier. She'd started following Juniper around the stall, learning how to be a horse. "She's going to be beautiful," Lillian said, watching the foal nurse. "She'll be a good working horse. That's what matters." "Can't she be both?" Caleb leaned against the stall door. "Out here, pretty doesn't count for much. What matters is whether she can handle the work, whether she'll keep going when things get hard." Lillian looked at him, something sharp in her eyes. "That's a bleak way to see the world. It's an honest way." "Honest and bleak aren't mutually exclusive, Caleb." He didn't have an answer for that, so he just headed back to the cabin. Behind him, he heard Lillian talking to the horses again, her voice softer than it ever got when she spoke to him. The days got shorter and colder. By mid-November, they were down to about 8 hours of real daylight, and the temperature rarely climbed above freezing. Caleb started teaching Lillian how to handle the other aspects of ranch work. How to check the cattle for signs of disease, how to spot when a fence line was about to fail, how to read the weather by the way the clouds moved over the mountains. She learned fast, faster than he expected. Within 2 weeks, she could throw hay as well as he could, knew which animals needed watching, could tell by the sound of the wind whether they were in for a light snow or a real storm. "You're a natural at this," he said one afternoon as they finished reinforcing the barn roof. "I'm a survivor," she corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "A natural loves the work. A survivor just does what needs doing." She hammered another nail into place with more force than necessary. "I don't love this, Caleb. I'm just good at not dying." That shut him up for a while. That night, a real storm rolled in. Caleb could feel it coming all afternoon, the pressure drop, the way the animals got restless, the particular quality of silence that settled over everything before the wind picked up. By the time they got back to the cabin, the first gusts were already rattling the shutters. "How bad?" Lillian asked, watching him check their supplies. "Bad enough. We might be stuck inside for a few days." He pulled out their stockpile of firewood, made sure they had enough. "You ever been through a real blizzard before?" "No." "It's loud. The wind sounds like it's trying to tear the roof off. Snow piles up against the walls so high you can't see out the windows. If you go outside, you can get lost 10 feet from your own door because you can't see your hand in front of your face." "Sounds terrifying." "It is. First few times, anyway. You get used to it." He stacked more wood by the fireplace. "But we'll be fine as long as we stay inside and keep the fire going." The storm hit around midnight. Lillian woke to the sound of wind screaming around the cabin, so loud it felt like the whole structure might lift off its foundation. She climbed down from the loft to find Caleb already up, feeding more wood into the fireplace. "Can't sleep through it," he said when he saw her. "Your first time, anyway." She sat at the table, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. The cabin creaked and groaned under the assault, but it held. Outside, the world had disappeared into howling white chaos. "How long will it last?" she asked. "Could be a day, could be 3. No way to know." They sat there in the firelight while the storm raged. After a while, Caleb made coffee and they drank it in silence, listening to the wind. "You want to know something funny?" Lillian said eventually. "I thought Montana would be peaceful, quiet. All that open space, those mountains, I thought it would be calm. It is calm. 90% of the time, it's so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat." Caleb stared into his cup. It's that other 10% that'll kill you. Is that what happened to your wife? The question came out of nowhere, sharp and unexpected. Caleb's hands tightened on his cup. I'm sorry, Lillian said quickly. I shouldn't have. Fever. The word came out rough. Her and my son both. 3 years ago, right at the end of winter, the doctor was in Bitterroot, and the roads were still blocked with snow. By the time I could get him here, it was too late. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry doesn't change anything. He set his cup down harder than he meant to. That's why I wanted the arrangement clear. No feelings, no expectations. Just two people working together to survive. That's all this is. Lillian was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful. You don't have to worry about me falling in love with you, Caleb. I'm not built for it anymore. What's that mean? It means I learned the same lesson you did. Caring about people gets you hurt. Trusting them gets you destroyed. Better to keep your distance, do what needs doing, and not expect anything soft or easy. She pulled the blanket tighter. We're the same that way, you and me. We're both just trying to survive without feeling too much. He wanted to argue with that, but he couldn't, because she was right. The storm blew itself out after 2 days. When it finally stopped, they dug themselves out to find the world transformed. Snow had drifted up against the cabin walls, some drifts higher than Caleb's head. The path to the barn was completely buried. The sky was clear and painfully blue, the sun reflecting off all that white snow bright enough to hurt your eyes. All right, Caleb said, grabbing shovels. Let's get to work. It took them most of the morning to dig out the barn. They found the animals huddled together for warmth, hungry but alive. While Caleb broke ice and threw hay, Lillian checked each one over, looking for signs of frostbite or injury. We lost 3 chickens, she called from the coop. The rest are fine. Could have been worse. A lot worse. Caleb had lost whole herds to storms like this one, back when he was still learning how to read the weather, still figuring out how to survive out here. They worked through the afternoon, checking fence lines where they could reach them, making sure the cattle hadn't wandered too far in the storm. The sun was setting by the time they made it back to the cabin, both of them exhausted and half frozen. Lillian made dinner while Caleb thawed out by the fire, some kind of stew from their dwindling supplies stretched with vegetables from the root cellar. It was good. Better than good, actually. Where did you learn to cook like this? He asked. My mother, before she died. Then later, when it was just my father and me, I had to figure it out on my own. She ladled more stew into his bowl. You learn fast when the alternative is going hungry. Seems like you learned a lot of things fast. Had to. She sat down across from him. My father was good with horses, but terrible with money. After my mother died, he started drinking, started gambling. By the time I was 16, we'd lost everything except the horses. By the time I was 20, we'd lost those too. How old are you now? 24. She met his eyes. You? 32. You look older. Montana does that to you. She almost smiled. I suppose it does. They ate in silence for a while. Outside, the temperature was dropping again, the clear sky meaning another brutally cold night. The work you did today, Caleb said eventually. With the animals, clearing the barn. You didn't complain once. Would complaining have made the work go faster? No. Then why waste the energy? He looked at her across the table, this woman who'd stepped off a train 3 weeks ago looking like she belonged in a drawing room somewhere, and who now had calluses forming on her hands and could throw hay with the best of them. You're tougher than I gave you credit for, he said. I told you, I'm a survivor. Yeah, you did tell me that. Something passed between them then. Not quite trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of respect. An acknowledgement that they were both exactly what the other one needed, even if neither of them had expected it. The next morning, Caleb woke to find Lillian already up and gone. He found her in the barn, sitting in the straw beside Juniper's stall. Hope was sprawled beside her, the filly's head in Lillian's lap while she stroked the small horse's neck. She likes you, Caleb said. The feeling's mutual. Lillian didn't look up. She reminds me of a filly my father had when I was a girl. Same coloring, same stubborn personality. What happened to her? Sold. along with everything else. Her hand stilled on Hope's neck. I begged him not to sell that one. She was the last good thing we had. But the debt collectors didn't care about sentiment. Caleb crouched down beside them. Hope opened one eye, decided he wasn't interesting, and went back to sleep. I meant what I said before, he said, about you being good at this. The work, I mean. You're not just surviving, you're actually helping, making things better. Lillian looked at him, surprised. That might be the nicest thing you've ever said to me. Don't get used to it. This time she did smile, just a little. I won't. December came in cold and stayed that way. They settled into a routine that felt less like two strangers coexisting and more like an actual partnership. Caleb started teaching Lillian how to shoot, spending an afternoon with his rifle showing her how to sight down the barrel, how to account for wind, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it. Why do I need to know this? She asked after missing the target for the 5th time. Because if something happens to me, you need to be able to protect yourself and the livestock. He adjusted her grip. Try again. Breathe out slow and squeeze. This time she hit the tree trunk they were using as a target, not center, but close enough. Better, Caleb said. You're a terrible teacher. And yet you're learning. She shot him a look but lined up for another try. This one hit closer to center. You're a natural, he said, echoing what he'd told her about ranch work. I'm a survivor, she corrected automatically, then caught herself. We need to find you some new material. He almost laughed. Actually almost laughed, which shocked him more than it probably should have. They kept practicing until the light started to fade, Lillian's aim getting steadily better. On the walk back to the cabin, she was quiet. What are you thinking about? Caleb asked. That I never thought I'd be learning how to shoot a rifle on a Montana ranch with a husband I barely know. She glanced at him. My life took some strange turns. Regret it? She considered that for a long moment. No, not yet anyway. Ask me again when winter's over. Fair enough. That night after dinner, Lillian pulled out a small leather journal from her carpet bag. Caleb watched her write in it by lamplight, her hand moving steadily across the page. What are you writing? He asked. Notes, about the ranch, the animals, things I've learned. She didn't look up. I want to remember it all, just in case. In case what? In case this doesn't work out, in case I have to start over somewhere else. She closed the journal. I know you said this is permanent, but I've learned not to count on permanent. Nothing's guaranteed, Caleb admitted, but I keep my word. You do the work, you've got a place here. That's the deal. And if I want more than just a place? The question hung between them, dangerous and loaded. Like what? He asked carefully. I don't know yet. She set the journal aside. But I'm starting to think maybe survival isn't enough anymore. Maybe I want something that actually feels like living. Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. But later, lying in bed while Lillian slept in the loft above, he thought about her words. About the difference between surviving and living. About whether he'd been doing either one for the past 3 years. The cold got worse as December wore on. They lost 2 more chickens and one of the older cattle to the weather. Caleb took it hard, even though he tried not to show it. It happens, Lillian said, helping him drag the dead cow away from the others. You can't save them all. I should have brought them in closer. Should have checked on them more. You did everything you could. She stopped, made him look at her. Some things you can't control, Caleb. The weather, the cold. You can prepare for it, but you can't stop it from taking what it wants. That's supposed to make me feel better? No, it's supposed to keep you from tearing yourself apart over things that aren't your fault. He wanted to argue, but he was too tired. Instead, he just nodded and finished the work. Christmas came and went without acknowledgement. Caleb had stopped celebrating it after Sarah died, and Lillian didn't seem inclined to bring it up. They worked through the day like any other, tending animals and keeping the cabin warm. But the next morning, Caleb came down to find she'd made something special for breakfast. Real eggs from their dwindling supply. Bacon she must have been saving, even some kind of sweet bread. What's this? He asked. Breakfast. She set a plate in front of him. I know we didn't do anything yesterday, but I thought maybe today we could at least eat something that isn't beans and salt pork. He looked at the food, then at her. Thank you. You're welcome. They ate in comfortable silence, the small luxury of a good meal making everything feel a little less harsh for a moment. After breakfast, Caleb went out to check the horses and found Lillian had already been there, had already fed them and mucked the stalls and was now brushing down Juniper with long, careful strokes. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "I know, but I wanted to." She moved to Hope, who pressed her head against Lillian's chest, demanding attention. "Besides, I like spending time with them. They don't expect anything from me except hay and water. It's refreshing." "Unlike me." "You don't expect much either, actually. Just work. Honestly, it's probably why this arrangement works. We both know exactly what the other one wants." "And what do I want?" She looked at him over Hope's back. "A partner who won't leave, won't die, won't make you feel things you don't want to feel. Someone reliable and tough enough to make it through the winter." "And what do you want?" "The same thing, more or less. Safety, distance from my past. A place where I can work hard enough that I don't have to think about anything else." She went back to brushing Hope. "We're a good match that way." Caleb supposed she was right. But there was something about the way she said it, like she was trying to convince herself as much as him, that made him wonder if either of them actually believed it anymore. New Year came. They were 6 weeks into the marriage, 2 months into winter. The ranch was holding together. The animals were mostly healthy. Their supplies would last through to spring if they were careful. By any practical measure, the arrangement was working. So why did Caleb find himself watching Lillian more and more, noticing the way she moved around the cabin, the sound of her laugh when Hope did something amusing, the careful way she handled the injured animals like each one mattered personally to her? Why did he care that she still slept in the cold loft instead of the warm bed? Why did it bother him that she still called him Mr. Mercer sometimes when she was tired or distracted? He tried not to think about it, tried to focus on the work, on keeping everything running, on getting through each day. But it was getting harder to ignore the fact that somewhere along the way, this had stopped feeling like a business arrangement and started feeling like something else entirely. Something dangerous. Something he'd sworn he'd never let himself feel again. The fight started over something stupid. It was mid-January, the kind of cold that made your lungs hurt when you breathed. They'd been checking fence lines all morning, looking for damage from the latest storm, and Caleb's hands were so numb he could barely feel the wire cutters. When he finally got the broken section repaired, he turned to find Lillian struggling with the roll of wire, her fingers clumsy in her thick gloves. "You're doing it wrong," he said. "I'm doing it fine." "If you were doing it fine, the wire wouldn't be tangled." He reached for it. "Here, let me—" "I don't need your help." She yanked the wire away, which only made the tangle worse. "I can figure it out." "Yeah, clearly." He grabbed it anyway, his patience worn thin by the cold and the work and the fact that they'd been out here for 4 hours already. "Just let me do it. Stop treating me like I'm incompetent. Stop acting like you know everything when you've been doing this for 2 months." She threw the wire down between them. "You know what? I'm done. Fix it yourself." She started walking back toward the cabin, her boots crunching in the snow. "Where are you going?" Caleb called after her. "Away from you." "We're not finished here." "I am." He stood there watching her go, anger and frustration burning in his chest. The wire was still tangled, the fence wasn't done, and now he'd have to finish it alone in the freezing cold because she couldn't take a little criticism. By the time he got back to the cabin 2 hours later, his anger had cooled into something harder and colder. Lillian was at the stove, her back to him, making dinner like nothing had happened. "We need to talk about what happened out there," Caleb said. "Do we?" "Yes. You can't just walk away when things get difficult." She turned to face him, and he saw that she'd been crying. Her eyes were red, her face blotchy. It stopped him cold. "You think I walked away because things got difficult?" Her voice shook. "I've spent 2 months proving I can handle difficult. I've worked through storms and freezing cold and pain and exhaustion without complaining once. But you can't let me struggle for 5 minutes without stepping in like I'm some kind of child who needs rescuing. I was trying to help. You were trying to control." She wiped her eyes roughly. "Just like every other man I've ever known. My father did it. The men he owed money to did it. And now you're doing it too, except you dress it up as practicality instead of what it really is." "Which is?" "Fear." She said it quietly. You're afraid if you let me fail at something, the whole operation will fall apart. You're afraid I'll prove you right, that bringing me here was a mistake, that I'm not strong enough, that eventually I'll leave like everyone else in your life. The words hit too close to something true. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. That's not what this is about, isn't it? Lillian crossed her arms. You've spent 3 years alone because you're terrified of needing anyone. And now you've got someone here, someone who's actually helping, and you don't know what to do with it except push them away before they can hurt you. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? She moved closer, her eyes fierce. I see you, Caleb. I see how you wake up in the middle of the night and stare at the ceiling. I see how you avoid looking at that photograph on the shelf, the one of your wife and son. I see how you work yourself half to death every day because if you stop moving, you might have to feel something. Stop. Why? Because it's too close to the truth? She didn't back down. You want to know why I walked away today? Because for 1 second, just 1 second, I wanted to see if you'd trust me to figure it out on my own. If you'd believe I could handle something without your supervision. But you couldn't do it. You had to step in and take over, and I realized that no matter how hard I work or how much I prove myself, you're never going to see me as an equal partner. You're always going to see me as someone who might leave. The silence that followed was crushing. Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was wrong, that this had nothing to do with fear or trust or any of the things she was accusing him of. But the words wouldn't come because somewhere deep down, he knew she was right. I lost everything once, he said finally, his voice rough. My wife, my son. I watched them die and couldn't do a damn thing about it. So yeah, maybe I am afraid. Maybe I do try to control things because if I don't, if I just let things happen. He stopped, the old grief rising up in his throat. I can't go through that again, Lillian. I won't survive it a second time. Her expression softened, just slightly. I'm not asking you to go through anything. I'm just asking you to let me be your partner instead of your responsibility. I don't know how to do that. Then learn. She turned back to the stove. Because this arrangement only works if we're both equals. I didn't come here to be managed, Caleb. I came here to build something. He left the cabin without another word, needing space to think. He ended up in the barn checking on the horses, even though he'd already checked them twice that day. Hope came over to the stall door, nickering softly, and he reached out to stroke her nose. Your friend's mad at me, he told the filly, and she's probably right to be. Hope just looked at him with those big dark eyes, waiting. I don't know how to do this, Caleb admitted. Don't know how to let someone in without waiting for them to leave. Don't know how to stop trying to control everything because if I do, it all falls apart. The filly nuzzled his hand and he realized how ridiculous this was, standing in a barn at night, confessing his fears to a horse. But there was something about the quiet, the darkness, the simple warmth of an animal who didn't judge or demand or need anything from him except hay and water. When he finally went back inside, Lillian was already in the loft. He could hear her moving around up there, getting ready for bed. He wanted to climb up there, to apologize properly, to tell her he'd try to do better, but the latter felt like an impossible distance, and the words felt too big for his throat. So instead, he just called up softly, Lillian? The movement stopped. What? I'm sorry. For today. For treating you like you couldn't handle it. A long pause. Then, okay. I'll try to be better about it. Okay? Not forgiveness exactly, but not rejection either. It would have to be enough for now. The next morning, they worked in careful silence. Not angry silence that had burned itself out overnight. Just the quiet of two people figuring out how to move around each other after a wound had been exposed. Lillian made breakfast. Caleb fed the animals. They met back at the cabin and ate without talking much, the space between them full of things neither knew how to say. I need to ride out and check on the north pasture, Caleb said finally. Some of the cattle drifted up there during the last storm. Want to come? It was an offering, a chance to work together instead of separately. Lillian looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Yeah, I'll come. They saddled two of the geldings and rode out into the bright, frozen morning. The snow was deep enough that the horses had to work for every step, their breath coming out in great clouds of steam. Caleb led the way, following the fence line north toward the high pasture where he'd spotted cattle tracks the day before. The silence stretched between them, but it felt different now. Less hostile, more thoughtful. "Can I ask you something?" Lillian said eventually. "Go ahead." "How did you end up here? In Montana, I mean. This doesn't seem like the kind of place someone chooses by accident." Caleb was quiet for a while, watching the mountains rise ahead of them. "I grew up in Missouri. Farm country. My father wanted me to take over the family place, but I wanted something different. Something that was mine, you know? So when I was 22, I came west. Worked as a ranch hand for a few years, learned the business. Met Sarah at a dance in Bitterroot. She was the daughter of the man I was working for." "What was she like?" "Strong, practical. She knew ranch life, knew what she was getting into when we got married." He paused. "We built this place together. Started with nothing but 100 acres and a dream. Took us 6 years to get it to where we had a real house, real stock, a life worth living." "And your son?" "Daniel. He was 4 when the fever came." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. He was the kind of kid who was always getting into things, always asking questions. Wanted to know how everything worked, why the sky was blue, where the stars went during the day. I used to tell him stories at night, make up adventures about cowboys and Indians, and his voice broke. He stopped talking. Lillian didn't say anything for a while, just rode beside him, letting the silence hold the grief. "My mother died when I was 12, she said finally. Cholera. It swept through our town one summer, took half the population with it. My father never really recovered. He started drinking, gambling, trying to fill the hole she left. But you can't fill a hole like that. You can only fall into it." "Is that what happened? He fell in?" "Deeper and deeper, until there was nothing left." She stared ahead at the white landscape. "By the time he died, I was almost relieved. Does that make me a terrible person?" "No. It makes you honest." They found the cattle huddled in a natural windbreak formed by rocks and trees. 15 head, all accounted for, all looking relatively healthy despite the cold. Caleb and Lillian circled them slowly, checking for injuries or signs of illness. "They look good," Lillian said. "Better than I expected." Caleb counted them again, just to be sure. "We'll leave them here for now. This spot gives them decent protection, and there's still some grass they can get to under the snow." On the ride back, Lillian pulled up beside him. "Thank you." "For what?" "For telling me about them. Your family. I know that wasn't easy." Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone who understood loss in the same bone-deep way he did. Someone who knew what it meant to keep going when everything inside you wanted to stop. "Thank you for listening," he said. Something shifted between them in that moment. Not a wall coming down exactly, but maybe a door opening, just a crack, just enough to let a little light through. They got back to the ranch as the sun was starting to set, painting the snow orange and pink. While Caleb unsaddled the horses, Lillian went to check on Hope. He heard her laughing at something, the first time he'd heard that sound in days, and when he looked over, he saw the filly had managed to steal Lillian's hat and was tossing it around the stall like a toy. "She's incorrigible," Lillian called over, trying to retrieve the hat while Hope danced away from her. "She gets it from her mother. Juniper's an angel. Juniper once kicked me so hard I couldn't sit down for a week." Lillian laughed again, and the sound did something strange to Caleb's chest, made it feel tight and loose at the same time, like something was breaking open in there. That night, after dinner, they sat by the fire with coffee. Lillian had her journal out, writing notes about the cattle they'd seen, the condition of the north pasture, things she wanted to remember. "What else do you write in there?" Caleb asked. "Thoughts, mostly. Things I notice. Sometimes I write letters to my mother, even though she's been dead for 12 years. "What do you tell her?" "That I'm still here, still surviving, that I found a place that's hard and cold and beautiful in a way I didn't expect." She looked up at him. "That I met someone who understands what it means to carry grief and keep going anyway." The firelight caught in her eyes, made them look darker, softer. "I don't know if I'm keeping going or just going through the motions," Caleb admitted. "Maybe there's not much difference. Maybe going through the motions is how you keep going until one day you realize you're actually living again. You think that's possible? I don't know, but I'd like to find out. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and fear in equal measure. Caleb wanted to reach across the space that separated them, wanted to touch her hand or her face or something that would bridge the gap, but he couldn't. The fear was still too strong. Instead, he just said, "Me too." January bled into February. The cold stayed brutal, but they'd found their rhythm again. Working together felt easier now, less like a negotiation and more like a dance they both knew the steps to. Lillian stopped waiting for Caleb's approval before making decisions about the animals. Caleb stopped hovering over her shoulder, started trusting her judgment. And slowly, without either of them really acknowledging it, the walls between them began to come down. It started small. Caleb finding excuses to work closer to where Lillian was. Lillian laughing more freely at his rare attempts at humor. The two of them staying up later by the fire, talking about nothing important, just filling the silence with words instead of letting it grow heavy. One night, Lillian came down from the loft, shivering so hard her teeth were chattering. "It's freezing up there," she said, wrapping a blanket around herself. "I told you it would be. Heat rises, but not that high." "I'm fine." "You're shaking." "I said I'm fine." But even as she said it, another shiver ran through her. Caleb stood up, made a decision that probably wasn't wise, but felt necessary. "Take the bed tonight. We've been through this." "I'm not arguing about it. You're freezing. The bed's warmer. Take it." "Where will you sleep?" "I'll manage." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Just for tonight." "Right, just for tonight." Except it wasn't just for one night. The next night, when Lillian started to climb the ladder back to the loft, Caleb stopped her. "Don't be stubborn. It's just as cold tonight as it was yesterday." "Caleb, please, Lillian, just take the damn bed." So she did. And the night after that. And the night after that. And somehow, without ever discussing it, the arrangement became permanent. Caleb took the loft, gave her the warm corner by the fireplace, and told himself it was just practical, just making sure she didn't freeze to death in her sleep. He almost believed it. The storm warnings came on a Tuesday. Caleb had learned to read the signs over the years, the way the air pressure changed, how the animals got restless, the particular color the sky turned before a big snow. This time, all the signs were pointing to something worse than usual. "We need to bring the cattle in closer," he told Lillian over breakfast. "All of them. And stock up on firewood. This one's going to be bad." "How bad?" "Bad enough that I don't want any animals too far from the barn. Bad enough that we might not be able to get outside for days once it hits." They spent the morning riding out to the far pastures, driving cattle toward the home ranch. It was hard work. The cows didn't want to move, kept trying to drift back to their familiar grazing areas. But between Caleb and Lillian working together, they managed to get most of the herd within a quarter-mile of the barn by early afternoon. "That's the best we can do," Caleb said, watching the cattle settle into the closer pasture. "The rest are too scattered. We'll have to hope they find shelter on their own." Lillian nodded, her face red from the cold and the effort. "What else?" "Wood. We need enough to last us a week, maybe more." They spent the rest of the day splitting and stacking firewood, carrying load after load into the cabin and the covered area near the barn. By the time the sun started to set, they'd built up a supply that should see them through even the worst storm. But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something, that there was one more thing they should be doing, one more preparation they should be making. The wind picked up after dinner, rattling the shutters. Lillian stood at the window, watching the trees bend and sway. "When will it hit?" "Tonight, maybe a few hours from now." "Should we check the animals one more time?" Caleb nodded. They bundled up and headed out into the growing wind. In the barn, all the horses were restless. Even Juniper, usually calm, was pacing her stall. Hope pressed close to her mother, her ears flat against her head. "They know it's coming," Lillian said softly. Animals always know. They checked water, threw extra hay, made sure everything was secure. As they were finishing up, Hope suddenly bolted past them, squeezing through the barn door that Caleb had left cracked open. "No!" Lillian lunged for the filly, but Hope was already outside, spooked and running. Caleb swore and ran after her. Lillian right behind him. The wind was stronger now, starting to carry snow. Visibility was already dropping. He could just barely see Hope's dark shape heading toward the open pasture. "Hope!" Lillian called. "Come back!" But the filly kept running, terrified of something only she could sense. Caleb chased her for 100 yards before he realized the storm was coming faster than he'd thought. The snow was already falling harder, the wind picking up to a roar. In another few minutes, they wouldn't be able to see 10 feet in front of them. "We have to go back," he shouted to Lillian over the wind. "Not without her. Lillian, we can't. I'm not leaving her out here to die." She kept running, and Caleb had a choice. Let her go alone into the storm or follow her. It wasn't really a choice at all. They ran together into the whiteout, calling for Hope, the world disappearing around them in a wall of white. Caleb could barely see Lillian beside him, could barely hear her voice over the wind. The cold bit through his coat, his gloves, finding every gap and seam, and then, through the snow, he saw her. Hope, huddled against a rock outcropping, shaking and terrified. Lillian reached her first, wrapping her arms around the filly's neck. "I've got you. You're okay. I've got you." Caleb pulled off his coat and wrapped it around Hope's body, trying to provide some protection from the wind. "We need to move. Now." But when he turned to head back, he couldn't see the barn. Couldn't see anything except white. The storm had swallowed the world whole, and they were lost in the middle of it. "Which way?" Lillian shouted. Caleb tried to orient himself, tried to remember which direction they'd come from. But the wind was coming from all sides now, the snow so thick he couldn't tell up from down. He'd lived here for 9 years, knew every inch of this land, and he was completely, utterly lost. "I don't know," he said, and heard the fear in his own voice. Lillian looked at him, understanding what that meant. They were in the middle of a blizzard with no shelter and no sense of direction. The temperature was already well below zero and dropping. They had minutes, maybe, before the cold started to shut down their bodies. Hope whinnied, a high, frightened sound. And Caleb made a decision. "We stay here," he said, "against this rock. We huddle together for warmth and we wait it out. We'll freeze. We'll freeze faster trying to find our way in this. At least here we have some protection from the wind." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. They pressed together against the rock, Caleb, Lillian, and Hope between them. The filly was shaking so hard Caleb could feel it through his hands. He pulled Lillian closer, trying to share what little warmth they had left. "This is my fault," she said, her voice breaking. "I should have held on to her better." "Don't. This isn't anyone's fault. We're going to die out here because I couldn't hold on to a horse. We're not going to die." But even as he said it, Caleb felt the cold sinking deeper into his bones. His fingers were already numb. His face felt like ice. They sat there as the storm raged around them, the wind screaming, the snow piling up against their bodies. Caleb lost track of time. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like seconds. Everything blurred together into cold and white, and the sound of Lillian's breathing beside him. He thought about Sarah and Daniel, about whether he'd see them again soon, about whether dying in the snow was better or worse than dying in bed from fever, alone and helpless. He thought about Lillian, about how she'd come here looking for safety and instead had found death in a Montana blizzard because he'd brought her to this godforsaken place. "I'm sorry," he said, not sure if she could even hear him over the wind. "For what?" "For bringing you here. For this." Her hand found his, squeezed hard. "Don't apologize. This is the first place I've felt like I belonged in years. Even now? Even dying in a storm? Even now." She pressed closer to him. "At least I'm not alone. At least I'm with someone who sees me as something more than a debt to be collected or a problem to be solved." Caleb wanted to tell her she was more than that. Wanted to say that somewhere in the last 3 months, she'd become essential. That he'd started to need her in ways that had nothing to do with ranch work and everything to do with the sound of her voice in the morning and the way she smiled at Hope and the fact that she understood his grief without needing it explained. But the words wouldn't come. They never did when they mattered most. So instead, he just held her tighter and hoped she understood anyway. The cold was getting worse. Caleb could feel himself starting to drift, his thoughts becoming fuzzy and disconnected. He knew that was dangerous, knew it meant his body was shutting down, preparing to die. He tried to fight it, but it was getting harder to remember why fighting mattered. "Caleb," Lillian's voice came from far away. "Stay with me." "Tired," he mumbled. "I know, but you have to stay awake. You have to keep talking to me." "About what?" "Anything. Tell me about Daniel. Tell me what stories you used to tell him." So Caleb talked about cowboys and outlaws and adventures in the mountains, about a brave boy who could talk to animals and ride faster than the wind. His voice got weaker as he went, the words slurring together, but he kept going because Lillian asked him to. He didn't notice when he stopped talking, didn't notice when his eyes closed, didn't notice when the world finally, mercifully, went dark. The first thing Caleb became aware of was warmth. It came slowly, seeping into his frozen limbs like something impossible, something he didn't deserve. Then came the pain, sharp and immediate, his hands and feet burning as feeling returned to them. He tried to move and couldn't, his body too heavy, too confused about whether it was supposed to be alive or dead. "Don't move." Lillian's voice, hoarse and raw. "Just stay still." He forced his eyes open. The world swam into focus gradually, the familiar rough-hewn beams of the cabin ceiling, the stone fireplace blazing with heat, blankets piled on top of him so thick he could barely breathe. "What?" His voice came out as a croak. "You passed out. In the storm." Lillian's face appeared above him, pale and exhausted, her hair tangled and her eyes red-rimmed. "I thought you were dead." Memory came back in fragments. The blizzard, hope running, the terrible cold sinking into his bones as they huddled against the rock. And then nothing. "How did we get back?" "I dragged you." She said it matter-of-factly, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Well, mostly dragged. You were conscious enough to stumble some of the way, but you don't remember it." "That's not possible. I'm twice your size." "I didn't have a choice." She sat back, and he saw she was shaking. Not from cold, the cabin was warm enough, but from exhaustion, or fear, or both. The storm cleared for maybe 5 minutes, just enough that I could see the barn light through the snow. I got you up and we walked. And you kept trying to lie down, kept saying you just needed to rest. But I knew if you stopped moving, you'd die, so I hit you, and I screamed at you, and I pulled you along until we made it back. Caleb tried to process that. Tried to imagine Lillian, who'd arrived here 4 months ago looking like she'd never done a day's hard labor in her life, dragging his half-frozen body through a blizzard. "Hope?" he managed. "She followed us. She's in the barn, safe and warm." Lillian's voice cracked. "I almost lost you both. I almost killed you because I couldn't hold on to a scared horse." "That's not—" He tried to sit up and the room spun. Lillian pushed him back down. "You're staying in that bed until I say otherwise. You've got frostbite on your fingers and toes. Not bad enough to lose anything, I think, but bad enough that you're not walking anywhere for a few days." "Lillian, don't." She stood up abruptly, turned away. "Just don't say it wasn't my fault or that everything's fine. You almost died out there, Caleb. You were barely breathing when I got you inside. Your lips were blue and your skin was like ice, and I thought—" She stopped, her shoulders shaking. Caleb wanted to go to her, but his body wouldn't cooperate, so he just said quietly, "Come here." "No. Please." She turned back to him, and he saw tears streaming down her face. "I can't lose someone else. I can't. Everyone I've ever cared about has either died or destroyed themselves. And I came here because I thought if I just kept my distance, if I didn't let myself feel anything, I'd be safe. But then you almost died, and I realized I'm not safe at all because somewhere in the last 4 months I started to—" She stopped herself, but Caleb heard what she didn't say, heard it as clearly as if she'd shouted it. "I know," he said softly. "Me too." The admission hung in the air between them, huge and terrifying and impossible to take back. Lillian wiped her eyes roughly. "This wasn't supposed to happen. I know. We had an arrangement, a partnership. It was supposed to stay simple. Nothing about this has been simple since the day you got off that train." She laughed, a broken sound halfway between tears and something else. "No, I suppose it hasn't." She came back to the bed, sat on the edge of it, careful not to jostle his injured hands. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, both of them terrified and exhausted, and something else neither wanted to name. "I was so scared," Lillian whispered. "When you stopped talking, stopped moving, I was so scared." "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize, just don't do it again." "I'll try my best." She reached out, touched his face gently. Her hand was warm against his cold skin. "You told me about Daniel, in the storm, about the stories you used to tell him." "I don't remember that." "I know, but you did. You kept talking even when I thought you couldn't, and it was—" Her voice broke again. "It was the saddest thing I've ever heard. The way you talked about him, like you were saying goodbye." Caleb closed his eyes. "Maybe I was." "Well, I didn't let you, so you're stuck with me a while longer." When he opened his eyes again, she was still there, still looking at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Something open and raw and completely undefended. "Lillian," he said, and stopped, not knowing how to finish. "I know," she said again. Let's get you well first. Then we can figure out what this means." She stayed with him through the night, checking his temperature, changing his bandages, making sure he drank water and ate a little. The storm raged outside, as bad as Caleb had predicted, maybe worse. But inside the cabin, with the fire burning and Lillian there beside him, he felt safer than he had in 3 years. The next 3 days passed in a blur of pain and healing. The frostbite on Caleb's fingers and toes was bad enough that he couldn't do much more than sit by the fire and try not to move too much. Lillian took over everything, feeding the animals, keeping the cabin warm, making meals, checking the fence lines when the storm finally cleared. She was exhausted. He could see it in the way she moved, the dark circles under her eyes. But she never complained, never suggested he was being a burden. On the 4th day, when Caleb could finally walk without wanting to scream from the pain, he found her in the barn with hope. The filly had recovered completely from her adventure in the storm, and now she was prancing around Lillian, full of energy and mischief. "She doesn't even realize how close she came," Lillian said when she noticed him. "Just happy to be alive. No memory of almost dying." "Must be nice." Lillian looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her expression made his chest tight. "Are you okay? You shouldn't be walking yet." "I'm fine. Or I will be." He moved closer, leaning against the stall door for support. "I wanted to thank you for what you did, for saving my life." "You would have done the same for me." "Maybe, but you actually did it. That takes something I'm not sure I have anymore." "What's that?" "The ability to risk everything for someone else." He looked down at his bandaged hands. "After Sarah and Daniel died, I promised myself I'd never care about anyone that much again. Never put myself in a position where losing someone could break me. But you went into that storm anyway. You risked your life for mine, and for a horse you've only known a few months." "They're not just a horse and a man I've only known a few months." Lillian's voice was quiet. "They're my family now, the only one I have." The word landed between them like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples out in every direction. "Is that what we are?" Caleb asked. "Family?" "I don't know what else to call it. We live together, work together, take care of each other. We know each other's worst fears and biggest losses. If that's not family, what is?" He didn't have an answer for that. Wasn't sure he wanted to examine it too closely, afraid of what he might find. That night, for the first time since the storm, Caleb climbed the ladder to the loft to sleep. But halfway up, his injured hands couldn't hold his weight, and he nearly fell. Lillian caught him, steadied him. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You're sleeping in the bed. I'll take the loft. We've been through this, and now we're going through it again, except this time you're actually injured, and I'm not going to argue about it." She helped him back down. "Besides, the bed's big enough for 2 people if they don't mind being close." The suggestion hung in the air, charged and dangerous. "Lillian, I'm not suggesting anything except practical sleeping arrangements." But her cheeks were flushed. "We're both adults. We're married, even if it is just on paper. And frankly, I'm tired of freezing in that loft while you pretend chivalry is more important than common sense." She had a point, several points actually. "All right," Caleb said finally, "but I sleep on the outside edge, just in case you need to get up in the night." "Deal." They settled into the bed awkwardly, both of them acutely aware of the other's presence. The bed was big enough, but barely. Caleb could feel the warmth of Lillian's body beside him, could hear her breathing in the darkness. "This is weird," she said after a while. "Yeah." "But also kind of nice?" "Yeah." They lay there in silence for a long time. Caleb thought she'd fallen asleep until she spoke again, her voice soft. "Caleb?" "Hmm? I'm glad you're alive." "Me too." "I mean it. When I thought you were going to die out there, I realized that this arrangement, this marriage, it stopped being practical a long time ago, at least for me." He turned his head to look at her, could just make out her profile in the darkness. "When did it change? For you?" "I don't know exactly. Maybe that first night with Juniper and Hope. Maybe when you started teaching me to shoot. Maybe it was 100 small moments that added up to something I didn't expect." She paused. "When did it change for you?" "I think it was always changing, from the first day. I just didn't want to admit it." He reached out, found her hand in the dark. "I'm not good at this, Lillian. Letting people in. Caring about what happens to them. Last time I did that, it destroyed me." "I know, I'm not good at it either." Her fingers laced through his, careful of the bandages. "But maybe we can be bad at it together." "That doesn't sound very romantic." "Good, because romance is what gets you hurt. Partnership is what keeps you alive." "Is that what you want? Partnership?" "I want—" She stopped, seemed to be choosing her words carefully. "I want to stop pretending this is just a business arrangement. I want to stop sleeping in separate places and acting like we're strangers who happen to share a house. I want to try being honest about what this is becoming, even if it scares the hell out of both of us." Caleb's heart was pounding hard enough that he was sure she could hear it. "And what is it becoming?" "I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out." He pulled her closer, awkward with his injured hands, but determined. She came willingly, settling against his side like she belonged there. Which maybe she did. "Okay," he said into her hair. "We'll figure it out. Together." "Together," she agreed. They fell asleep like that, tangled together in the bed that had once been Caleb's alone, the walls they'd built around themselves starting to crack and crumble. The weeks that followed were different, softer somehow, despite the continued cold and the endless work. They moved around each other with a new kind of awareness, touches lingering a little longer than necessary, conversations extending into the night. Caleb found himself watching Lillian more, the way she hummed while she cooked, the concentration on her face when she was working with the horses, the soft smile she gave Hope every morning. He noticed things he'd been trying not to see before. How her hair caught the firelight, the curve of her neck when she tilted her head, the sound of her laugh when something genuinely amused her. And Lillian, for her part, seemed to be noticing him too. He'd catch her looking at him across the cabin, her expression thoughtful. She started touching him more, a hand on his shoulder when she passed, her fingers brushing his when she handed him coffee, her body pressing close when they worked together in tight spaces. It was careful, tentative, like they were both afraid that moving too fast would break whatever fragile thing was growing between them. One night in late February, after they'd gone to bed, Lillian rolled over to face him in the darkness. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Do you still love her, Sarah?" The question should have hurt, but it didn't. Caleb thought about it, really thought about it, for the first time in a long time. "I'll always love who she was," he said finally, "but I don't think I'm in love with her anymore. I don't think I have been for a while. I just didn't know how to let go." He paused. "Is that terrible?" "No. I think it's honest." Lillian was quiet for a moment. "I think we hold on to the dead because letting go feels like losing them all over again. But maybe loving someone's memory isn't the same as being in love with a ghost. You're pretty wise for someone who's only 24. I'm pretty damaged for someone who's only 24. Damage and wisdom look similar from a distance." He touched her face, traced the line of her jaw. "I don't think you're damaged." "Liar. We're both disasters. That's why this works. We understand each other's broken parts." "Maybe. Or maybe we're less broken than we think." She kissed him then, soft and careful and full of question. Caleb kissed her back, and it felt like falling and flying at the same time. like something opening up inside his chest that had been locked for 3 years. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathing hard, Lillian pressed her forehead against his. "This changes things," she whispered. "I know." "Are you ready for that?" "No, but I don't think I ever will be, so we might as well try anyway." She laughed softly. "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me." "I'm working with limited material here." "You're doing fine." They kissed again, and this time it was less careful, less questioning. This time it was a promise, and a claiming and a letting go all at once. And when they finally fell asleep, wrapped around each other in the darkness, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. March came in with more snow, but also the first signs that winter wouldn't last forever. The days were getting longer. The sun, when it appeared, had actual warmth to it. The cattle were starting to get restless, sensing spring even if it was still weeks away. Caleb and Lillian worked together to take stock of what they had left, what they'd lost to the winter. They'd lost 6 head of cattle total, which was better than Caleb had feared. The horses were all healthy. Their supplies had held out, though they were down to the bare minimum. "We made it," Lillian said one morning, standing in the barn doorway and looking out at the mountains. "We actually made it through." "We did." Caleb stood behind her, his arms around her waist, though there were a few times I wasn't sure we would. "That storm, when you almost died." "Yeah, that one." She leaned back against him. "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "This place, the ranch, it's ours now, isn't it? Not just yours. Ours. It's been ours since you saved Juniper and Hope, maybe even before that. Then I want to expand it. I want to breed Hope when she's old enough, build up a line of good working horses. I want to plant a real garden in the spring, put up more vegetables so we're not eating salt pork all winter. I want—" She stopped, turned in his arms to face him. "I want to build something here, something that lasts." "You mean you're planning to stay?" He said it lightly, but he needed to hear the answer. "Where else would I go? This is home now." The word hit him harder than he expected. Home. Not just a place to survive, but a place to belong. "I want that too," he said. "All of it. Building something that lasts. Even if it's hard?" "Especially because it's hard. Easy things don't mean anything." She kissed him, and he thought about how far they'd both come from that cold October day on the train platform. 2 strangers making a practical arrangement, both of them so sure they could keep their hearts locked away and safe. They'd been wrong about that, but maybe being wrong was the best thing that could have happened. That night, Lillian was sick. She barely made it outside before losing her dinner, and when she came back in, she was pale and shaking. "Must have been something I ate," she said. "We ate the same thing." "Then maybe I'm just tired. It's been a long winter." But the next morning, she was sick again, and the morning after that. And it was Caleb who finally put the pieces together. The nausea, the exhaustion, the way her body seemed to be changing in small ways he'd been too stupid to notice. "Lillian," he said carefully, "when was your last monthly?" She looked at him, confused. Then understanding dawned on her face, followed quickly by fear. "No, that's not... We only just—" "When?" he asked again. "I don't know. I wasn't paying attention. With everything else going on, I just—" She sat down hard on the nearest chair. "Oh." They stared at each other, both of them trying to process what this meant. A baby. Despite their careful distance, despite all their precautions, somehow life had found a way. "Are you sure?" Lillian whispered. "No, but it fits." He knelt in front of her. "How do you feel about this?" Terrified. "Yeah, me too." She touched his face. "I watched my mother die giving birth to my little brother. He died too 3 days later. I've been afraid of this my whole life. I watched my son die of fever, couldn't do anything to stop it." He took her hand. "So we're both scared, but we're also both still here. We survived a Montana winter. We survived that storm. We can survive this too." "You don't know that." "No, but I choose to believe it anyway." She pulled him close, buried her face in his shoulder. He could feel her shaking, fear and hope warring in her body. "We'll get through this," he promised. Whatever happens, we'll get through it together. Together, she repeated, like she was trying to convince herself. Spring came slowly, then all at once. The snow melted, revealing the brown grass underneath. The creek swelled with runoff. Birds returned to the trees around the cabin, filling the mornings with sound. And Lillian's belly began to swell. She handled the pregnancy the way she handled everything else, with determination and very little complaining. But Caleb could see the fear underneath, saw how she touched her stomach sometimes like she was trying to protect what was growing there, saw how she flinched whenever he mentioned the baby, like talking about it might jinx something. "You need to see the doctor," he said one morning in April. "I'm fine." "You need to see the doctor," he repeated. "Please, Lillian, just to make sure everything's okay." She was quiet for a long time. "I'm afraid of what he might tell me." "I know, but not knowing won't make it any less scary." So they made the trip to Bitterroot, Lillian riding in the wagon because Caleb wouldn't let her on a horse. The doctor, an older man named Patterson who'd been treating ranchers for 30 years, examined her thoroughly while Caleb waited outside, pacing. When Lillian finally emerged, she looked shaken, but not devastated. "Well?" Caleb asked. "He says everything looks normal. The baby's healthy, growing right on schedule. I'm healthy too, despite losing weight over the winter." She took his hand. "He says there's no reason to think this won't go fine." But he's not making any promises. He says childbirth is always dangerous, especially out here where help is hours away. He says I should think about staying in town when I get closer to my time." "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it. But Caleb, I can't leave the ranch for weeks. What about the animals? What about Hope and the garden and all the work that needs doing?" "I can handle it." "Can you? You've been teaching me for months because it's too much for one person." He pulled her close, right there on the street in Bitterroot, not caring who saw. "Then we'll figure it out. But I'm not risking you just to save some cattle or vegetables. You're more important." "Since when?" "Since always. I just didn't want to admit it." They rode back to the ranch in silence, both of them thinking about what was coming, about the risk and the fear and the possibility that, in a few months, they might lose everything they'd built, or they might gain more than either of them had dared to hope for. Summer arrived with heat that felt like a blessing after the brutal winter. Lillian's belly grew round and prominent, making it harder for her to work. But she still tried, still insisted on helping with everything until Caleb physically stopped her. "You're going to hurt yourself," he said, taking the bucket of water from her hands. "I'm pregnant, not fragile. You're both. And I'm not taking any chances. You're being overprotective." "Damn right I am." He glared at him, but there was affection underneath it. "Fine, but I'm not sitting around doing nothing. I can still cook and work with Hope and rest." "You can rest. That's allowed too, you know." They argued about it constantly, Lillian insisting she was fine and Caleb insisting she slow down. But underneath the arguments was a tenderness that hadn't been there in the early months. A care that went beyond partnership into something deeper, something that felt a lot like love, even if neither of them had said the word yet. One evening in late August, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and red. Lillian's hand rested on her belly, feeling the baby move inside her. "It's strange," she said. "A year ago, I was running from men who wanted to own me. Now I'm sitting here with a husband I actually chose and a baby on the way and a home I helped build. I keep waiting for it to fall apart. It won't. You can't know that. Maybe not, but I can choose to believe it." He took her hand. "I spent 3 years believing nothing good would ever happen again, that I'd just survive until I didn't. But you changed that. You made me believe things could be different. I didn't do anything except show up and refuse to leave. That was enough." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I love you, Caleb Mercer. I know we're not supposed to. I know this was supposed to stay practical, but I do. I love you." The words hit him like a physical thing, opening up something in his chest that had been closed for too long. "I love you too," he said, and it felt like the truest thing he'd ever spoken. "I love you, and I'm terrified of losing you, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure we all get through this alive. We can't control everything." "No, but we can try." They sat there as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way, holding on to each other against the fear of what was coming. And when the baby kicked hard enough that Caleb could feel it through Lillian's dress, he let himself hope that maybe, just maybe, this story would have a different ending than the last one. September came with cooler nights and the first hints of gold in the aspen leaves. Lillian was 8 months along now, moving slowly, her body heavy with the weight of the baby. Caleb watched her constantly, terrified every time she winced or touched her back or paused to catch her breath. "You need to stop hovering," she said one afternoon, catching him staring at her from across the cabin. "I'm not hovering. You've checked on me 4 times in the last hour. That's hovering. I'm just making sure you're comfortable. I'm 8 months pregnant in Montana. Comfortable isn't an option." She shifted in her chair, trying to find a position that didn't hurt. "But I'm fine. The baby's fine. You don't need to act like I'm going to break." But Caleb couldn't help it. Every time he looked at her, he thought about Sarah, about how she'd seemed fine right up until she wasn't, about how quickly things could go wrong, how little control he'd had over any of it. "Talk to me," Lillian said softly. "What are you thinking about?" "Nothing." "Liar. You get this look on your face like you're somewhere else. Somewhere dark." He sat down across from her. "I'm thinking about the last time. With Sarah. How I missed the signs that something was wrong. How by the time I realized, it was too late." "I'm not Sarah." "I know that. But what if I miss something again? What if I'm so busy trying not to be afraid that I don't see when you actually need help?" Lillian reached across the table, took his hand. "Then I'll tell you. I promise. If something feels wrong, if I'm scared, I'll say it. But you have to trust me to know my own body. I'm trying. Try harder." She squeezed his hand. "Because this fear, it's going to eat you alive if you let it. And I need you present, Caleb. Not lost in what happened 3 years ago." She was right. He knew she was right. But knowing it and actually doing it were two different things. That night, Lillian woke him in the darkness, her hand gripping his arm hard. "Caleb." He was awake instantly. "What's wrong?" "I don't know. Something feels different." "Different how?" "Pressure, low down, and my back hurts worse than usual." She took a shaky breath. "It might be nothing, but I think it might be starting." Caleb's heart kicked into overdrive. "It's too early. You've got another month." "Babies don't always follow schedules." He lit the lamp with shaking hands. Okay. What do you need me to do?" "I don't know." For the first time since he'd known her, Lillian looked genuinely frightened. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Dr. Patterson said—" Caleb tried to remember the instructions the doctor had given them. "He said you'd have contractions. Regular pains that get closer together. Are you having those?" "I don't think so. It's just constant right now, but it's getting worse." "I'm going to get Mrs. Hutchins from town. She's helped with births before, That's 2 hours there and 2 hours back. You can't leave me alone that long." She was right. And if this was actually labor, 4 hours might be too long. "Then I'll deliver the baby myself if I have to." "You don't know how I've delivered enough calves and foals. Can't be that different." "It's very different, Caleb." "Then you'll have to tell me what to do." Another pain hit her, strong enough that she gasped and doubled over. When it passed, she was breathing hard, sweat beading on her forehead. "That was a contraction," she said. "A real one." "How long since the last one?" "I don't know. 10 minutes, maybe?" Caleb grabbed his coat. "I'm riding to Bitterroot. I'll be back with help as fast as I can. You stay in bed. Don't push. Don't do anything." "Caleb." Lillian's voice was tight with pain and fear, but also something else. Determination. "You can't make it there and back before this baby comes. You know that. I have to try." "No. You have to stay here. With me." She held out her hand. "Please. I can't do this alone." He looked at her. This woman who'd faced everything Montana threw at her without flinching, who'd dragged him out of a blizzard, who'd turned his cold, practical arrangement into something real, and he knew she was right. "Okay," he said, taking her hand. "Okay. We'll do this together." The next few hours were the longest of Caleb's life. The contractions came faster and harder, each one tearing through Lillian until she was crying out with the pain. Caleb did what he could, held her hand, wiped her face with cool water, timed the contractions like Dr. Patterson had told him. But mostly, he just felt helpless. "I can't do this," Lillian gasped between contractions. "It hurts too much. I can't." "You can. You're the strongest person I know." "I'm not strong enough for this." "Yes, you are." He pushed her sweat-soaked hair back from her face. "You survived your mother's death and your father's destruction. You escaped men who would have owned you. You made it through a Montana winter. You saved my life in a blizzard. You can do this." "What if something goes wrong? What if the baby?" "Then we'll handle it, together, like we handle everything else." Another contraction hit, the worst one yet. Lillian screamed, and the sound of it cut through Caleb like a knife. He wanted to take the pain from her, wanted to trade places, wanted to do anything except watch her suffer. When it finally passed, she was panting, exhausted. "I need to push." "Are you sure?" "I can feel it. The baby's coming. I need to push." Caleb had no idea what he was doing, but he didn't have a choice. He positioned himself where he could help, trying to remember everything he'd learned from delivering animals, knowing it wasn't enough, but praying it would be. "Okay," he said. "On the next contraction, push." The next hour was a blur of pain and effort and fear. Lillian pushed until she was hoarse from screaming, until Caleb thought she might actually die from the sheer exertion of it. And through it all, he stayed with her, encouraging her, telling her she could do it even when he wasn't sure either of them believed it. And then, finally, he saw the baby's head. "I can see it," he said, his voice shaking. "Lillian, I can see the baby. One more push, just one more." She bore down with everything she had left, and suddenly the baby was sliding into Caleb's hands, tiny and slippery, and covered in blood, and absolutely perfect. For a terrible moment, the baby didn't move, didn't cry. Just lay there in Caleb's hands, still and silent. "No," Lillian whispered. "No, please." Caleb remembered this part from the animals, cleared the baby's nose and mouth, rubbed its back, trying to stimulate breathing. "Come on," he thought desperately. "Come on, breathe." And then, like a miracle, the baby gasped, coughed, and let out a thin, angry wail. Caleb nearly collapsed with relief. "It's a girl," he said, his voice breaking. "We have a daughter." He wrapped the baby in a clean towel and placed her on Lillian's chest. Lillian's hands came up to cradle the tiny body, tears streaming down her face. "She's alive," Lillian whispered. "We're both alive. You did it. You actually did it." "We did it." The baby was small, too small probably, from being early, but she was breathing on her own and crying lustily, and when Caleb counted her fingers and toes, they were all there. "She's beautiful," he said softly. "She looks like an angry potato." "The most beautiful angry potato I've ever seen." Lillian laughed weakly, then winced. "Is it over? Please tell me it's over." "Almost. There's still the afterbirth." "I know. I just need a minute first." She held their daughter close while Caleb finished what needed to be done, cleaning up the worst of the mess, making sure Lillian wasn't bleeding more than she should be. When he was finally satisfied that she was stable, he collapsed in the chair beside the bed, exhausted. They sat there in the lamplight, the three of them, while dawn started to break outside. The baby had quieted, was making small, snuffling sounds against Lillian's chest. Lillian looked exhausted but alive, more alive than Caleb had ever seen her. "We need to name her," Lillian said after a while. Caleb thought about it, about Hope, the filly who'd survived against the odds, about the storm that had almost killed him, and how Lillian had refused to let him go, about how they'd both come here broken and somehow put each other back together. "Sarah," he said quietly, "after my first wife. And Grace, because we were given more grace than we probably deserved." Lillian looked at him, surprised. "You want to name her after Sarah?" "Sarah would have liked you, would have respected what you did tonight, how strong you are. And I think it's time I stopped treating her memory like a wound and started treating it like what it was. A good thing that ended too soon, but still a good thing." "Sarah Grace Mercer," Lillian tested the name. I like it. Me too. The baby, Sarah Grace, chose that moment to open her eyes. They were dark, unfocused, but alert, looking at the world she'd just been born into like she was already trying to figure it out. She's got your stubbornness, Caleb said. Good, she'll need it out here. When the sun was fully up, Caleb finally rode to Bitterroot to get Dr. Patterson. The doctor came back with him, examined both Lillian and the baby, and pronounced them both remarkably healthy, considering the circumstances. You got lucky, Patterson said bluntly. She's small, and being early is always risky. But her lungs are strong and she's nursing well. Keep her warm, watch for fever, and she should be fine. And Lillian? Caleb asked. Tired, which is normal. Keep her in bed for at least a week. Make her rest even when she insists she doesn't need to. He looked at Caleb. You did good work here. Not many men could have handled that alone. I didn't have a choice. We always have choices. You chose to stay. That matters. After the doctor left, Caleb sat with Lillian and Sarah while both of them slept. He watched the baby breathe, watched the tiny rise and fall of her chest, and felt something crack open inside him that he'd thought was permanently closed. Love. Not the careful, measured partnership kind of love he and Lillian had built. Something bigger and more terrifying. The kind of love that made you vulnerable to loss, to pain, to all the things Caleb had spent 3 years trying to avoid. But he couldn't avoid it anymore. Didn't want to. The weeks after Sarah's birth were hard in a different way than winter had been hard. Lillian was exhausted. The baby cried constantly, and neither of them slept more than a few hours at a time. The ranch work piled up because Caleb couldn't bring himself to leave them alone for more than an hour. This is impossible, Lillian said one night, rocking a screaming Sarah while tears ran down her face. I can't do this. I'm too tired. She won't stop crying. I don't know what she needs. Give her to me. Caleb took the baby, started walking her around the cabin. You need to sleep. I can't sleep when she's crying. Yes, you can. Lie down. I've got her. But, Lillian, trust me, please. She finally gave in, climbing into bed and falling asleep almost instantly. Caleb kept walking with Sarah, who eventually quieted down and fell asleep against his shoulder. He stood there in the dark cabin, holding his daughter, and thought about how much had changed in a year. A year ago, he'd been alone, broken, waiting for winter to either kill him or prove he was tough enough to survive it. Now he had a wife who'd become his partner and his best friend, and the person he loved more than he'd thought possible. He had a daughter who'd survived being born too early on a Montana ranch with only her terrified father to help. He had a home that felt like more than just a place to survive. He had a life worth living. The seasons turned. Winter came again, but this time they were ready for it. They had more supplies, more firewood, a stronger barn. And they had Sarah, growing bigger and stronger every day, her dark eyes watching everything with fierce curiosity. Lillian had been right about hope. They bred her when she was old enough, and she produced a strong colt that Caleb sold for good money. With that money, they bought more cattle, expanded their herd. The garden Lillian planted produced more than they could eat, so they sold the surplus in Bitterroot. The ranch was thriving. They were thriving. One evening in March, exactly a year after that terrible storm that had almost killed Caleb, they sat on the porch while Sarah played at their feet. She was 6 months old now, big enough to sit up on her own, grabbing at everything she could reach. You know what I was thinking about today? Lillian said. What's that? The day I got off that train. How we both thought we'd made a terrible mistake. How neither of us could afford to turn back even though we wanted to. I remember. If someone had told me then that a year later I'd be sitting here with you and our daughter, that I'd actually be happy, I wouldn't have believed them. She leaned her head on his shoulder. I came here to hide, to survive. I never expected to actually live. Me neither. Caleb watched Sarah try to grab a blade of grass, her tiny fingers clumsy but determined. But somewhere along the way, surviving turned into something more. Do you ever regret it, taking that risk on me? Every day. She pulled back to look at him, hurt flashing across her face until she saw he was smiling. I regret it, he said, because if I'd known how much you were going to change my life, I would have been even more terrified than I already was. Would have probably talked myself out of it. And then I'd have missed all of this. That's a terrible way to say you love me. I'm working on my romantic skills. Give me time." She kissed him, soft and sweet, while Sarah made happy babbling sounds at their feet. "We should probably go inside," Lillian said after a while. "It's getting cold." "In a minute. I just want to sit here a little longer." So they sat, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and gold. The same mountains that had seemed so harsh and unforgiving when Caleb first came here. The same land that had taken so much from him. But it had also given him this moment, this family, this second chance at a life he'd thought was over. Sarah started to fuss, and Lillian picked her up, held her close. "We should really go in. Someone needs to eat." "You go ahead. I'll be right there." He watched them go inside, his wife and daughter, and felt a peace he'd never expected to feel again. The ranch would always be hard. Winter would always be brutal. There would always be risks and losses and things beyond his control. But he'd learned something in the last year, something Lillian had taught him without even trying. You could survive by keeping everyone at a distance, by refusing to feel anything, by treating life like a transaction where nothing really mattered except making it through another day. That's what he'd been doing for 3 years. Or you could live. You could take the risk of caring about people, of building something that mattered, of letting yourself hope for more than just survival. It was terrifying and messy, and sometimes it hurt like hell. But it was also the only thing worth doing. Caleb stood up, looked out at the land he'd built his life on, the cattle in the distance, the barn where Hope and her colt were settling in for the night, the cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, warm light spilling from the windows. A year ago, he'd ordered a practical mail-order bride to help him survive the winter. Instead, he'd gotten Lillian Hart, stubborn, damaged, absolutely perfect Lillian, who'd saved his life in more ways than one. And together, they'd built something that went far beyond survival. They'd built a home, a family, a future. Inside, he could hear Sarah starting to cry, and Lillian talking to her in that soft voice she used when she was trying to soothe her. He could smell dinner cooking, could feel the warmth from the fireplace, even out here. Caleb smiled and headed inside, closing the door behind him against the Montana cold. He had a family to take care of, a ranch to run, a life to live. And for the first time in 3 years, he couldn't wait to see what came next. 5 years later, the ranch had grown into something neither Caleb nor Lillian had imagined that first winter. They had 50 head of cattle now, a string of good working horses descended from Hope's line, and a reputation in Bitterroot for breeding stock that could handle Montana's brutal climate. Sarah was 5 years old, wild and fearless, already learning to ride on a gentle mare named Sweet Pea. She had her mother's determination and her father's quiet stubbornness, and she approached the world with the confidence of a child who'd never known anything but love and security. They'd added onto the cabin, built a proper bedroom, and a workspace where Lillian kept her breeding records and garden plans. The root cellar was full, the barn was sound, and they'd finally replaced all the fencing that had been falling apart when Lillian first arrived. One spring morning, Caleb stood on the porch watching Lillian teach Sarah how to plant seeds in the garden. Sarah was asking 1,000 questions, the way she always did, and Lillian was answering each one patiently. "Why do we put them in the ground?" "Because that's where they grow." "But why?" "Because they need the soil and the water and the sun." "But why?" "Because that's how plants work, sweetheart. Some things just are the way they are." "But why?" Lillian caught Caleb's eye and grinned. He grinned back, thinking about how she'd looked that first day, elegant and out of place and absolutely terrifying to a man who'd convinced himself he'd never care about anyone again. Now she was wearing work clothes, her hands dirty from planting, her hair in a simple braid down her back. She looked like she belonged here, like she'd always belonged here. "Daddy!" Sarah spotted him and ran over. "Mama's teaching me to grow tomatoes." "Is she now?" "Huh. And when they get big, we can eat them. But it takes a long time, forever and ever." "About 3 months," Lillian corrected, coming over to join them. "That's forever when you're 5, Caleb said, picking Sarah up and swinging her around until she shrieked with laughter. "Can I go see Hope now?" Sarah asked when he set her down. "You just saw her an hour ago." "But I need to tell her about the tomatoes." "Then you better go tell her, but be careful in the barn." Sarah took off running, all energy and excitement, and Caleb watched her go with a mixture of love and terror that he was getting used to. Parenthood, he'd learned, was mostly just being terrified that something would happen to this person you loved more than your own life. "She's going to give us gray hair before she's 10, Lillian said, slipping her arm around his waist. "Probably, but I wouldn't change it." "No, neither would I." They stood there together, watching their daughter disappear into the barn, watching the sun climb higher over the mountains, watching the life they'd built together continue to unfold in ways both ordinary and miraculous. "You know what today is?" Lillian asked. "March 15th. 5 years since that storm. Since I dragged your frozen body out of a blizzard and realized I couldn't let you die." "Best worst day of my life." She laughed. "Mine, too." Caleb pulled her closer, breathed in the scent of her hair, felt the solid warmth of her body against his. 5 years, and he still couldn't quite believe this was real, that he got to have this, that he'd been given a second chance and had somehow managed not to completely mess it up. "I love you," he said, because he'd learned to say it now, had learned that words mattered even when action spoke louder. "I love you too." She turned in his arms to face him. "Even though you're still terrible at romance." "Hey, I'm getting better. I brought you flowers last week." "You brought me wildflowers you picked on the way back from checking the north pasture." "Still counts." She kissed him, and it still felt like the first time, like falling and flying and finding home all at once. From the barn they heard Sarah's voice calling out, probably telling Hope all about tomatoes and why they had to grow in the ground, and asking questions the horse definitely couldn't answer. "We should probably make sure she's not trying to climb into the stall again," Lillian said. "Probably." But they stood there a moment longer, just holding each other, grateful for this life they'd built from 2 broken pieces and a desperate arrangement that had somehow become something real. The ranch stretched out around them, 600 acres of Montana that could kill you if you weren't careful, but could also give you everything if you were brave enough to fight for it. The mountains rose in the distance, still snow-capped even in spring, beautiful and deadly and permanent. And in the barn, a 5-year-old girl was telling a patient horse about tomatoes, her voice full of wonder and questions, completely secure in the knowledge that she was loved and safe and home. It wasn't the life Caleb had planned, wasn't the life Lillian had dreamed of back when she was running from debts and dangerous men. But it was theirs, built from hard work and harder choices, from surviving when survival seemed impossible, from learning to trust and love and hope again when both of them had given up on all 3. And that made it perfect. Not perfect in the fairy tale sense. There were still hard days and brutal winters and work that never ended. There were still scars from the losses they'd both endured, still moments when the fear crept back in. But perfect in the way that real things are perfect. Flawed and difficult and absolutely worth fighting for. Caleb Mercer had ordered a mail-order bride to help him survive a Montana winter. Instead, he'd found something he'd thought he'd lost forever. He'd found a reason to live.